So without further ado, Regina, please, the floor is yours.
Okay. So I wrote this paper with a student of mine, just to keep it all in the family this morning, Tim Modell. Tim lives in California, so he's not here this morning. I want to talk about Russian electoral reform in the context of the discussion that you all have been having, and highlight that Russian electoral reform, systemic reform, is a form, I think, of electoral malfeasance that is designed to legitimize the electoral system itself. So the democratic nature, or the performative democratic nature of the reform, legitimizes the election itself, and it limits the consequences of electoral falsification or electoral change in important ways that emerge in our analysis. So every time I use the word democratic, it's in quotes. Every time I use the word legitimate, it's in quotes. And every time I use the word reform, it's in quotes. So please don't hear me as sort of justifying these changes. So we started, we had been thinking, Tim and I, about this paper for a while, and then read the reviews of the manuscript proposal and started to think more carefully about why, or what are the patterns of electoral system reform that we see in Russia, and why more generally do we study electoral system reform in authoritarian states where institutional change is imposed rather than achieved or negotiated. So we refer to this as electoral engineering, right? Which highlights that elections in this case emerge as a crucial element of regime development and as regime evolution. And I think that's one big takeaway here from those of us who live in the world of authoritarian institutions or institutionalisms, that here you see how important the institutions are for providing incentives for behavior. So what we've seen, though, is that the use of institutions can either be to consolidate power, if that's a possibility, or to fragment the opposition. So the same sets of institutions can be used in different ways. So there are a range of goals of authoritarian governments and the range of strategies they use to hold power and manage the opposition. The principles that are at the heart of this conference in our story provide an early warning system to backsliding. So, and I'm going to try to make that point clearly as I go through. And then to link this idea of sort of democratic performance as the principles sort of legitimize the backsliding in elections by making the changes appear democratic, even as they're creating distinct advantages and creating an uneven playing field in the system. And I think the other interesting thing that comes out of this analysis, and we heard some of this yesterday about Mexico, about Hungary, even about Peru, about solving the problems of post-election protest. So again, what this analysis put onto the table for us is, although it's now become quite common to think about challenges to authoritarian regimes coming only from elites, and elites being left out of the system, in Russia, the management of the electoral system is about staving off mass protest, about staving off the problem of post-election protest. So overall, we see that what we're calling reform is really regime adaptation to existing conditions between elections as they're looking forward to the next election. that regime adaptation stalls the opposition learning strategies. So if you keep changing the rules, it's very hard for oppositions to keep up and understand how to build electorates, how to coordinate on their strategies, and how to make voters aware of manipulation. So each time the rules change, it's harder to understand what's happening. And then that electoral rule change facilitates new types of electoral malfeasance. So every time the rules change, it creates opportunities to choose off the menu of manipulation. So we'll see in a sec the value of state financing changes as Mr. Putin adopts a PR system, and the state finances can be used to shore up the emerging hegemonic party. When he goes back to a hybrid system, gerrymandering becomes a core tool in the toolbox of the regime. And so does this concept of curated ballots, with a raft of regulations about how to register parties and how to register candidates, and bureaucratic sorts of issues that basically allow them to establish a ballot in which their preferred candidate is in the center and the opposition is fragmented. In this work, and we heard a lot about this yesterday in the case studies, we're taking a very broad look and underscoring the need to look at the broad nature of rules governing the electoral system. So Russia, like Ukraine in the paper yesterday, has experienced 3 wholesale changes in electoral rules since founding elections. But more importantly, and perhaps maybe more importantly for this system, the auxiliary mechanisms that govern the electoral process, whether people vote virtually or whether they vote at the voting booth, whether they vote in parks and or at home, or whether they take the trip to the voting booth, what kinds of regulations about finance, about media, about registration and ballot access, these auxiliary mechanisms there are myriad changes that go along with every systemic rule change. And if you look only at the systemic change, analysts are often fooled by the effect of those changes or mispredict the effect. It's only when we look at the entire picture that we get a good sense of what the regime's strategy is. And then I want to point out that increasingly we need to look at the laws adjacent to the electoral arena that change the electoral context and change the norms in which elections happening. And here we can think of laws on civic organization, like what the Georgians call the Russia law on foreign agents, that really profoundly change the role of civic organizations and constrict the role of civic organizations in electoral processes. Similarly, we have to think about limitations on speech, assembly, communication, and now in the most extreme cases, like my own, treason, charges of treason that keep candidates off the ballot, that limit and get rid of electoral organizations, and now even limit who can function as an electoral observer. And the last thing I want to do in terms of an introduction is the importance of constitutional change in the authoritarian process. So this is a tool the Russians have gone to quite frequently, usually not always, but for the most important changes, in tandem with a constitutional referenda. These referenda are usually, honestly, not legal. They don't have legal standing, and they don't ratify the changes that have already been made. They just give buy-in, and they influence how voters think about the change. And here, too, we see a lot of side payment. So President Putin has used constitutional change quite frequently over his term in office to affect elections including term limits, resetting the clock on his own terms, but also reinterpreting constitutional text in order to manipulate the rules. So the Russia story has four distinct periods, and we start in the Soviet period with the introduction of elections strategically to show how little has changed over these periods, really, but also to show the quick history of how electoral systems unfolded and became connected to each other. So we look briefly at Gorbachev and then Yeltsin, often considered to be the democratic period of Russia in the 1990s, and then the Putin period of autocratization and then autocratic consolidation. So we see in the Gorbachev period reform through accountability, trying to make the system more accountable. Yeltsin ostensibly to democratize. So there are differences in how electoral reform was implemented over these periods. Yeltsin, the Democrat, rules by decree. I'm going to show you a figure. So Yeltsin faces a period of feckless pluralism where no one's quite in charge of the system. It's very hard for him in the very early part of this system to enact change through formal processes, so he uses presidential decree. The use of presidential decree in elections goes on over time, although at a different rate. In the more autocratic phases under Vladimir Putin, the reform looks more reflective of the principles you promulgated. And this is the irony or the twist that we see in this paper, that as the autocrat gains more control, the autocrat's able to mimic the principles more closely to insulate the regime from charges of fraud. So we went into a database of Russian electoral regulations. These are major changes, right? These don't account for the bureaucratic changes or the changes at the level of the Central Election Commission. These are laws and decrees. And what you see very clearly are some pretty interesting patterns here. The first one is the one I already mentioned, Yeltsin ruling by decree in order to change the electoral system. Look at that, nearly 50 decrees having to do with presidential elections in the lead up to 1996, and also parliamentary elections in 1995. We see as Putin consolidates power after, say, 2002, 2003, a shift where changes are made by law through the parliament, through a normal parliamentary procedure. In Russia, this means laws are introduced by the presidential administration, handled by the committee, and brought to 3 readings of change. You also see in this graph peaks right before every election period. So as elections approach, the focus comes onto changing the rules, and those changes are implemented. Another interesting element of this figure is that you see, even as Putin is able to implement constitutional reform, run for re-election after 2020, extend again term limits to 6, so now he can run against twice. He's still changing, reforming electoral rules because the challenges remain salient in this system, right? So even as we approach 2021, another peak in electoral rule changes, and then after, looking forward to presidential elections in 2024, the same sort of peak. The last thing I'll say is you'll notice that even Putin needs the decree power in order to make some of these difficult changes. So it's a combination of decree and legal changes over time. These rule changes interacted with other aspects in the political system in order to consolidate the hegemonic party. And this is the most important piece of our background here, where you see the Russian system has changed with the proportion of the system dedicated to PR. The system, you see the challenge here to the Putin administration as the hegemonic party consolidates is they don't quite have a constitutional majority. They don't actually have a majority until 2007. These are outcome data, so they reflect also election fraud, right? So you have to consider that in the story, but I do think that it shows very clearly that the changes in system, 2007, it becomes a pure PR system. The regime is able to capitalize on that and create a constitutional majority, but the party of power really regains its constitutional or maintains them after it changes the system back to a hybrid system and is able to sweep to maintain a constitutional majority, I'm sorry, a simple majority in PR votes, and then using single member district seats to use different types of mechanisms and manipulation to get themselves to a constitutional majority. In the meantime, you see the sort of decline of the complicit systemic parties or complicit co-opted systemic parties, the communists on the left, the LDPR nationalists and fellow travelers, and then the very small liberal party condition. So we see the importance of this story, as in the story of Mexico, as in the story of Hungary that we heard yesterday, the importance of legislative control for creating a semblance of democratic performance. So the emergence of the hegemonic party allows the regime to play by the rules, to play by these principles that you've promulgated. We see consistently coherence in support of changing and adopting these rules. We see side payments to smaller parties. We talked about this yesterday in the Hungarian case. And you see this sort of emergence of the hegemon over time that provides a new tool in the electoral control toolkit. I think there are some takeaways for people who work on elections here, that in consolidated authoritarian states, electoral reform is a performance. So if the system is consolidated, if the legislature is controlled by a hegemonic party, then it can play by international norms and rules, while imposing uneven rules through nominally democratic practice, and that this process functions as a form of legitimacy for the regime, and it legitimizes elections, and that it's important in thinking about principles of electoral rule change to focus on frequency and scope and information about those changes. How visible are they? The visibility, these are information providing mechanisms. Rule changes, they provide a lot of information to people in the environment. And so the more visible the changes are, the more aware the population is of what their effects are and how they're working. And the last thing I'll say is that it's important really to look at the full picture of the laws governing elections, and not just what we often do, which is focus briefly on large systemic changes, ignoring the way in which the adjacent rules and the auxiliary rules come together to form a system of formal institutional constraint on opposition challenges and authoritarian advantages. And I'll say that the strategy mostly works, right, over time, over a long period of time. Regimes are able to deflect blame under these complex changes and constantly changing systems to lower level officials and bureaucrats. So we have survey data that shows that officials can say, all, and unfortunately the US president has now contributed to this discussion, all elections have some degree of problems and fraud. And, it's not us at the top here that creates these problems, it's the lower level. And here federalism is really an important component of deflecting blame, and decentralization, as Tova talked about in the American case, is important for maintaining popular perceptions. The multiplicity of changes hides the overall effect of rule changes. With the turn to PR in the low 2000s under Putin, people really questioned whether Putin was democratizing. Was this a democratizing move? And the answer in the context of the broader set of changes was a clear no. But if you look only at the introduction of PR, it's a much murkier situation. So new laws reset the perceptions of fraud, and they help to maintain the idea among a strong plurality of Russians that that elections are still free and fair, that they're democratic, that they provide choice. And I don't think those are disingenuous feelings. They're just maybe wishful thinking on the part of regime supporters, but also a failure to grasp the huge picture, as was made, the point was made about the constant changes in Ukraine. This is Grigory Melkianis. Grigory works for the watchdog Golos organization, now outlawed in Russia. He spent his whole life tracking these changes, and now, due to that work, he's sitting in prison. And this is sort of a big exclamation point on the need not to look only at the electoral system proper, but in the adjacent laws that take out the watchdogs, that take out the leaders. So here's a snapshot from the Central Election Commission room where they're observing 95,000 electoral precincts on cameras that were installed in 2011-12 in response to post-election protest, whose data is, if we discuss this in the paper, which is why I'm noting it, whose data is actually not available to the people you would like to be able to have it and scrub it. It's very much a performative mechanism. So I'll stop there. I know it's a sort of bigger picture than the discussions we had yesterday, but a lot of connections to what I was hearing in the discussion.
Thank you, Regina, for the not only the bigger picture, but also some very interesting angles of looking at how the things have evolved and how they are featured through the prism of principles, but also in comparison to the other countries that were presented in the course of these days. Leontine will give a feedback to the paper. The paper is also uploaded on the Electoral Integrity website, project's website, so you can also check it and download it and read it. And now I'm passing the floor to Professor James with the case study on UK. Professor.
Great. Brilliant. So what a presentation to follow. Thank you, Regina. A fascinating presentation. So now I bring something completely different in some ways. Maybe there are some similarities there across some of the other papers across the conference as we focus on the United Kingdom. And obviously, we've already heard from Patrick Thomas earlier on in the panel number 2 about how electoral reform works in general here. And I'm going to focus in on the case of how electoral reform has worked in one particular instance, one particular reform, which is the reform of voter identification. And in short, voter identification has been recently introduced, photographic identification for the whole of the United Kingdom, which came into force at the last general election. So as ever, I'll give a bit of historical background to this. We've had elections for a long time in the UK, so it's goes back a long way. It needs to go back a long way for reasons that will become clear. Introduce the reforms and then focus in on whether these were democratic electoral reforms, not in terms of whether they were good or bad electoral reforms. There's different views and opinions on that, but in terms of whether the principles that were set out at the start of the conference were followed, and what maybe are the general lessons from the UK, and when you're trying to introduce reforms in a majoritarian electoral democracy. So just some initial notes about the UK. We have the so-called Westminster model, which is often ingrained into many sort of textbooks. It's characterised by the absence of a codified constitution, parliamentary sovereignty, so the most powerful body in the land is Parliament. Any law that Parliament enacts becomes the law. And we have a majoritarian electoral system, which is a single member plurality electoral system. So this means in practice that any laws, any electoral laws that a party with a majority can carry in the House of Commons will be passed without other formal kind of checks. Since we have recently, however, had devolution to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, and they have different electoral systems for their own elections, but for the purpose of this paper, I'm really just going to focus in on the UK. We have a very decentralised electoral management system, so we have independent electoral officers around the country, hundreds of them running elections for their respective areas, subject to the laws set by Parliament. But we do have an independent electoral commission, which was fully independent until recently. The electoral commission here does not run elections. It provides guidance and best practices for running elections, but does not run elections itself. It instead is run by independent local electoral officers. And the UK is often described, I think rightly, as a democracy. It's one country that was amongst the first wave of countries to become a democracy, according to Samuel Huntington. But at the same time, over the last few years, there has been some concerns raised about whether there is democratic backsliding, potentially because some of the more recent kind of liberal policies that were passed. But clearly, we're in a very different situation to the last kind of case study of Russia. And so, in some ways, going all the way right back to the beginning, this paper looks particularly at voter identification requirements. It's important to say what the voter identification requirements were before this, and basically they have their roots in the Victorian era, or they did have their roots in the Victorian era. So some of the reforms that we had in the UK that led to the UK being considered a democracy were reforms such as the Secret Ballot Act of 1872, which made, as it says, the requirement that voting should be conducted in secrecy. Bribery and corruption was thought to be a problem in elections in the 19th century, and so we had prohibitive acts introduced during that time as well. And another important measure was somewhat later, the 1918 Representation of the People Act, which introduced an electoral register that we compiled by official electoral registration officers. And that mattered for the conduct of elections, the practice of casting a vote, because it meant that when people went into a polling station, they would be a register and they would have their names checked off the register when they voted. They did not have to provide any identification. They simply had to state their name. And therein remained much of the practices across the UK, different trajectory slightly in Northern Ireland, which we'll touch on. And constitutional reform in general was not considered a salient political topic for much of the 20th century, for example, until maybe the late latter part of that, where there did become a movement for constitutional reform under the Conservative government in the 1980s. But narrowing down to voter identification and this practice really of how people can cast a vote in polling stations, the real moment of change, before we come to our sort of main case study, that is worth introducing is some of the new Labour reforms that were introduced when they came into power from 1997. So what the Home Secretary Jack Straw did was to follow an informal constitutional practice, was to set up a committee after the election, allocated to a junior minister in the Home Office, but on a cross-party basis to bring respective stakeholders together to reflect on the election, to think about what worked well, what did not work well, and to get some recommendations for moving forward. And that cross-party committee recommended that there should be major change. And so practices, George Howarth argued, which were laid down largely at the end of the 19th century, were in urgent need of reform. And this document became the blueprint for major revision of how we cast votes in the UK under the Labour governments. The major change was the introduction of universal postal voting on demand. So anyone can vote via post. You have to apply for that. And over time, postal voting became a very significant part of UK elections, with nearly a quarter of actual votes now cast by post rather than in person. There are also some other innovations. So, for example, attempts to be able to cast your vote by your skybox. Some of these were successful. Leontine will remember these very well. Some of these less successful. But there then did follow something of a backlash to these reforms as cases of electoral fraud did come to the fore, particularly with respect to postal voting. So the focusing event was a high-profile case in Birmingham in 2004, where in local elections, it was found that several thousands of votes were cast bogusly, and that there was therefore a major opportunity for electoral fraud to take place. So electoral reform and electoral fraud was high up on the political agenda at the end of this time. There was a change in government, and the Labour Party left power, and in their place came the Conservative and Liberal Democratic coalition. And their response to this was to introduce individual voter registration. That was seen as part of the problem leading to these cases of electoral fraud. It should be said that while Labour were in power, they did actually introduce some other provisions to tighten up on postal voting. Is that coming across louder? Okay.
Yeah, it's much better.
It's much better.
So individual voter registration became quite important, but we now focus on the issue of voter identification and photographic identification that was introduced under the Conservative governments during this time. And again, another focusing event was a high-profile case of electoral fraud, this time in the Tower Hamlets, London Borough of Tower Hamlets in 2014. It was found that there was a range of different irregularities, not always to do with the voting process, which led to a court annulling that election and forcing the mayor to stand down from power. This event led to the Conservative Prime Minister at the time to appoint Sir Eric Pickles, who was then the government's anti-corruption champion, to set up a review of electoral fraud. So this was a body set up to come up with some recommendations. And Eric Pickles' report was published roughly a year afterwards and set out 50 recommendations for what should be done. And the There's so many things that became part of that, but the key recommendation for purposes of this paper or presentation was basically that it should be not necessarily be over elaborate, according to him, as it should be proportional. Driving license, passport, utility bills would not seem unreasonable. So this was in some ways the agenda setting item. The government responded at Christmas, 27th of December 2016, to say that it was fully in support of Sir Eric Pickle's proposals and intended to undertake some pilots. And so 3 different piloting models were undertaken during the elections, local elections in England in May 2018 and 2019. The models involved a more restrictive model, photographic identification. So basically present your passport plus a driving license. A slightly more liberal option where you could, if you didn't have your passport, you could instead provide some non-photographic identification. Or a third option, which is slightly more liberal, where you could instead just present your poll card. Everyone in the UK, if you're registered, should receive a poll card telling you where to vote on the day of election. So sorry, there's loads of text on the screen here, and maybe this is for later, but I just want to emphasize here 2 things. There are evaluations took place. So there was an evaluation that took place from the Electoral Commission, which was broadly very positive. It emphasized that the scheme worked, but that for a small minority, this was a problem. Some people were not able to cast their vote. And in particular, they emphasized that this could be different for particular age groups. Also, they noted that Black and ethnic minority respondents found it more difficult to provide vote identification than others. By contrast, the Cabinet Office evaluation, which involved some similar data but some different data, provided a much more positive picture of how of the outcome here. So the picture was that actually, according to them, data collected does not indicate that any one demographic of those examined was adversely affected across the pilots and the metrics involved there. Following the pilots, the government continued. So obviously this was a period of quite political turbulence in the United Kingdom. We did have lots of prime ministers come and go in light of sort of Brexit and ongoing debates there. But eventually the Conservative Party did put into the 2019 manifesto a commitment to continue with voter identification. And legislation was introduced a couple of years later that under the so-called Elections Bill that would make it compulsory for people to provide voter identification in polling stations. So in particular, the provision stated that a ballot paper must not be delivered to people who did not present the necessary forms of identification. And this bill, in the schedule, one of the accompanying schedules a long way down, set out some of the documents that would be required. It was subject to Parliamentary Select Committee scrutiny, so the Joint Committee on Human Rights. So it's a joint committee. This is from the House of Commons and House of Lords. Published a critical report about these proposals, raising concerns that it may lead to people not being able to vote. And it followed also that the PACAC committee that we heard from the clerk earlier on in this conference also published a report that was quite critical. It called on the government to not progress with these proposals unless there was sufficient further evidence put in place. The government did continue its course pretty much unchecked. The second reading came into the House in February 2022. For those unfamiliar with UK parliamentary practice, the first reading is pretty much a statement that there will be a bill. The second reading is when the real discussion takes place. It was met with quite substantial opposition outside of Parliament, to civil society groups such as the Electoral Reform Society argued that this was disproportionate and unfair against younger voters, for example, as opposed to older voters. Civil society mobilised quite strongly, and within Parliament the rhetoric was quite heated. So opposition parties across the board criticised the proposals, blocked the proposals at almost every opportunity, and claimed that this amounted to voter suppression. There was lots of claims that there are parallels to the methods being introduced in parts of the US, something from the so-called Republican playbook, and the idea was just to stop people voting according to the MPs. So you can see this became a very, very heated bill. It passed in the end very quickly. The government put through several bills in the course of 2 or 3 days. It ping-ponged within the Commons and the Lords, but eventually the Lords decided, or the Labour peers decided not to block it on the basis that it was in the Conservative Party manifesto, and so it proceeded to become legislation. And it therefore became first implemented at the May 23 local elections. Evaluating the elections, the Electoral Commission said that around 4% of non-voters said they didn't vote because of the voter identification requirement, and suggested that there should be some changes as a result.
Directorate for Democracy Support.
Meanwhile, the Democracy Volunteers also claimed that there was a sort of significant inequalities in the process. By contrast, the government used its own evaluation and its own data to point out that 99.75% of people had no problems, and that this was, a success story. We've obviously since then had the 2024 general election, where again we saw, according to the Electoral Commission, a similar story of around 4% of people who didn't vote because of this voter identification requirements. And partly because time has elapsed, and partly because this has now been scaled up, there's a range of other studies that have sort of identified the effects here. So people have different views about voter identification, whether it's good, whether it's bad, and I leave that aside really for the purposes of this. The question is, did this follow the principles? Was this a democratic electoral reform? And like Regina, I'm putting that in speech marks and inverted commas. So on the one hand, you can see some strength. The Pickles Committee provided an opportunity for input. It provided evidence, and everybody was allowed to submit evidence if they wanted to. So you could say the inclusion principle was kind of covered there. There was piloting provided. This was, quite extensive piloting. This didn't take place, within a short period of time. Piloting in 2018, piloting in 2019, bringing about rich evidence. This wasn't really rushed. Maybe the final parliamentary legislation was rushed, but actually there was quite a long lead in here. And you did see UK parliamentary institutions performing many key functions here. It provided evidence, it provided transparency, there was opportunity for inclusion, and there was consensus in those committees. But clearly there are weaknesses here as well. So it seems as if what's happened and fallen by the wayside has been this post-election reviews. We'll talk about the select committee in a moment, whereby there is everyone comes together to think about the proposals that could be taken forward. And the government, the Conservative government overseeing this, did not take that approach, and this was a particularly problematic. The Pickles report did not publish evidence that it received. There was no official secretariat. There's no minutes of those meetings, and so this became the focusing and defining report. But arguably there was a sort of lack of transparency and accountability there. The appointment of a government minister to oversee that also arguably created political tensions from the start. It maybe made people think that this might be motivated by something other than an attempt to increase the quality and security of the election. And in some ways the evidence, there was almost too much evidence. The dual track between the Cabinet Office and the the Electoral Commission created a sense in which maybe everyone could say something, and there was evidence that could be cherry-picked to support a particular case. So in terms of the lessons, I think there's some really good lessons to learn. I think the value of piloting reforms are really important. The select committees, parliamentary select committees, were very successful at bringing a cross-party position to this. But part of the ultimate problem here is that in a parliamentary majoritarian democracy, reforms can be put through with a majority irrespective of political opposition, and that really does partly speak to some of the problem in terms of realising the reforms. There's also some things to think about avoiding in the future. Avoid using non-official committees, for example, to develop recommendations. It's really good to see that the PACAP committee has at the moment undertaken a review of the most recent general election, and that would be an important starting point, you would say, to think about what reforms would be needed, and avoiding government appointments and trying to exclude civil society, whether deliberately or inadvertently, from the start of the process. I think Therese in the second panel was pointing to the need to really get everyone to understand the shared problem, and that didn't take place from this, and you can see the fallout that took place. And I think looking forward, we've got a new government at the moment in the UK, and it's not clear exactly what approach will be taken. They have said that they will bring legislation to change the franchise, to lower it to 16 for general elections, and there's also some promises there about trying to improve voter registration. The most recent statement on voter identification is that they're presently undertaking a review of the evidence, which is obviously important because evidence is important. But I think there was also the dangers here that this could fall into the repeats of previous governments and simply introduce legislation on the basis that it has a parliamentary majority. The government has a major majority in the UK at the moment, and there will therefore be relatively few barriers for it passing its legislation. So a broader secretariat, a broader inclusion of civil society actors, which is transparent, would be a really important way forward. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Professor James. So, two quite different pictures, if I may be diplomatic, based on the two presentations, and I will stop here, and I will now pass the floor to Leontine for a discussion on the papers and the presentations. Leontine.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you both, Toby and Regina, for very interesting papers to read, which made my life very easy and fun. I have some comments on both papers, but they are really rich and really interesting papers that teach us a lot about these case studies. So the comments are more to get them even better, but not to say that they're not good at all or that there are problems with them. Regina, I'll start with your paper first on Russia. I learned so much from your paper. I've heard about Russian elections, but the paper is really rich in information and in giving an historical background to these both periods in time. However, I think the paper could be strengthened by looking at the order in which the material is presented. Because it starts off with a more general discussion where you reference some of the changes that were made during the period, but they are explained more in detail starting from page 9 and further. So when I was reading the first part, I kept wondering what was the change that Yeltsin made to the electoral system, and what was the change that was made back, and then all that information came later on in the paper. So I think restructuring it in a way where you maybe give more of a general overview of the changes that were made in the beginning, so that the reader can more easily understand the very interesting discussion that comes straight from the beginning in the paper now, and taking into account that most readers probably won't know a lot about the Russian structure and the Russian system. And I think that also is true for the legislative system. There was a little bit more in your presentation about that, but I think maybe add a very, can be very brief, but a very brief description of how do laws actually come to pass in Russia, what's needed for that, because then it will also be easier to understand why Yeltsin had to use the rules by decree, where Putin had more of a possibility to actually change the laws, because for a non-versed reader, that's not really clear from the outset. So how do laws come to pass? What is needed for that? And why did Yeltsin not have that? I was also missing a little bit, I'm not sure if it's there, but what is the role of the courts in the Russian electoral system? So were there any challenges to these changes? Were there any challenges to the interpretation that Putin made from constitutional? Well, I can run again, because it doesn't mean a total term limit, but that means I have to step down for a little bit and then come back. So maybe you can enrich the paper a little bit more with that. And then in general, you did it more in the presentation, but I would love to see it back in the paper. The actual comparison of what happened with the criteria that were mentioned at the beginning of this conference and in the introduction of the book that's going to be written. And then, because I think your findings are really interesting, that actually in the more autocratic system, these criteria were met probably a bit more than in the more democratic period. And I think the paper could be strengthened by highlighting that conclusion even more, by discussing the individual criteria and also discussing why it was easier for Putin to meet them than for Yeltsin. I talked a little bit about the Netherlands yesterday and said you can have a reform that's good in its content but bad in the process, and vice versa. And I think your paper is a really good highlight of basically the opposite of the Dutch case, where the process of reform is good, but the contents and the direction of the reform are not good. And I think it would be very interesting to highlight those differences between countries. And then I have a couple of more detailed comments. I will email them to you, but I had a puzzling question on page 7, where you basically argue that if you frequently change the rules, that it can point towards a regime being under threat. And I was thinking about that when I was reading it, and I think in your case, in the case of Russia, you're absolutely true making that statement. But in general, I think it could also mean that a country is actually moving towards democratization and therefore is making a lot of changes in a short period of time. So I think this needs a little bit more explanation that this is true for a country moving towards autocracy, but not necessarily true in general. But overall, really great paper, very interesting, and thank you very much. And then Toby's paper, also very interesting, very good, very rich in material. Again, a couple of questions. When we're looking at ID laws, I think it also really matters if ID is mandatory for other areas. For example, in the Netherlands, everybody above 14 has to carry a governmental issued ID at all times. So if you then introduce voter ID laws, it's less of a problem than if you don't have that system, like in the US. So I think explaining that a little bit more, what are the ID laws in Britain in general, and how many people are expected to carry ID anyway, would probably help make the argument that is going through the paper a little bit, that this might be politically motivated, but might not be, but it's not really clear if it was. I think that would help. Also, you say that it was pointed out that older people are more likely to have these forms of IDs that are now prescribed. But I think it would, for a reader that doesn't understand the situation that much, it would be helpful if you add a couple more sentences why that is the case. So why are these ideas specifically for certain groups? Because that also emphasizes the argument that this might be to get certain voters to not vote. I know you've only had one election where this was rolled out completely, but is there any indication, that's a question, if this actually did lead to some changes in the outcome of elections? Or is there any clue that it might? Because that would be very interesting. And I was wondering, were there any court challenges, or is there any option of a voter to go to the court to say, this new law is infringing on my right to vote, and I was turned away because I don't have the idea, and I want to challenge that. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. And then I just have some more technical questions that comments that I'll put on the email to you. And then one final question, the role of the Electoral Council within the legal process, or in the lawmaking process, because they made a very clear recommendation that wasn't followed. So could you elaborate a little bit more on that? How do they play a role in the parliamentary debates on this law or not, and why is that? But also really good paper. So thank you very much.